The sky above the scorched wasteland did not crack from impact or explosion, but simply began to rot away in a jagged vertical line that smelled of sulfur and old rain. The tear in the fabric of the atmosphere widened silently. At first, a gaping black wound against the blue that defied the physics of the Dragon Ball universe. It was a violation of the natural order that sent birds plummeting from the air, dead before they hit the ground, their small life forces extinguished by the sheer density of the pressure bleeding through the rift. This was not the sharp electric sting of ki that the Z fighters were accustomed to sensing, but something far heavier and colder, a crushing spiritual gravity that felt like the weight of an entire ocean pressing down on the soul rather than the body. From the center of this abyssal tear, a figure fell not with the grace of a warrior who could fly, but with the chaotic tumble of a man ejected from a hurricane. Ichigo Kurosaki slammed into the hardpan of the desolate plateau with enough force to liquefy the rock beneath him. Yet there was no rising mushroom cloud and no deafening boom. Instead, the impact created a vacuum of sound, a momentary silence where the wind itself seemed afraid to move. The ground rippled outward in a wave of disintegration, turning solid stone into fine grey dust that hung suspended in the air. Miles away in the sanctuary above the clouds, Kami stumbled and clutched his chest, his ancient eyes widening in a terror he had not felt since the days of King Piccolo. This terror was different, however, because it did not stem from malice or evil intent. It was the terror of a sudden, devastating presence that felt like death itself had physically manifested on the mortal plane. He looked down through the clouds, his hands shaking as he tried to pinpoint the source, but he could not lock onto a key signature. There was no life energy to track, only a massive suffocating void that felt like a hole had been punched through the bottom of the world. On the plateau, the dust began to settle, revealing Ichigo on his hands and knees, coughing violently as he tried to purge the dimensional static from his lung. His shihakusho was tattered, the black fabric moving, as if it had a mind of its own, and his massive sword Tensa Zangetsu remained clenched in his right hand, its black chain rattling against the devastation he had caused. He tried to stand, but the gravity of this world felt wrong, alien and thin, compared to the heavy, reishi-dense atmosphere of Soul Society, or Huecomundo. Ichigo wiped blood from his forehead and looked around his eyes, trying to adjust to the blinding harshness of the sunlight, which felt too yellow and too near. He reached out with his senses, instinctively trying to find the familiar spiritual signatures of his friends or sisters, but he was met with a chaotic wall of noise. The life energy of this planet was deafening, loud and vibrant, an unrefined screaming with a vitality that assaulted his senses. It was overwhelming, like standing inside a jet engine. He tried to suppress his own Reiatsu, to hide his presence, a habit ingrained from years of fighting vastly superior opponents, but he found that his control was slipping. The atmosphere here offered no resistance to his spiritual pressure. Without the dense reishi of his home dimension to act as a buffer, his power was leaking out of him in torrential waves. The ground beneath his feet groaned and cracked further, the very soil unable to withstand the mere proximity of a transcendent being. He took a step, and the rock pulverized under his boot. He was a leaking nuclear reactor walking through a paper town, and he had no idea where he was or how to stop the bleeding of his own soul before it crushed everything within a 10-mile radius. In the distance, a green-skinned warrior paused in the middle of a wasteland training session, his cape fluttering in a wind that had suddenly turned cold. Piccolo turned his head sharply toward the south, his acute hearing picking up the heartbeat of the intruder, a sound that was slow, heavy, and terrifyingly powerful. The dust did not settle around Ichigo Kurosaki, so much as it recoiled from him, driven away by the pulsating aura that he could not seem to retract. He took a step forward, and the granite beneath his boot crumbled into powder not from the weight of his body, but from the sheer spiritual density radiating from his core. It felt as though he were walking on the bottom of a deep ocean, wearing a suit made of lead while everyone else was floating in zero gravity. The air in this world was too thin, too empty, and it lacked the reishi needed to form footholds in the sky, so he was forced to walk on the ground like a common human, which only added to his growing irritation. He sheathed the smaller of his two blades, but kept the larger kaiba knife variation of zangetsu in his hand, dragging the tip through the dirt, because lifting it felt strangely exhausting in this atmosphere. The connection to his inner world was static-filled and distant. Zangetsu's voice reduced to a murmur buried under the roaring noise of this planet's life force. This world was loud. It was a cacophony of living things screaming their existence into the void, a stark contrast to the regulated, disciplined spiritual ecostructure of the Soul Society, or the empty hunger of Hueco Mundo. Here everything was burning with unrefined energy. Ichigo focused his eyes trying to make sense of the horizon. He needed to find a town or a settlement, but he hesitated. If his mere presence was cracking the bedrock, what would happen if he walked into a city filled with fragile human souls? He remembered Aizen's Reiatsu erasing ordinary humans from existence just by walking past them. The thought made Ichigo freeze in his tracks, his knuckles turning white on the hilt of his sword. He was a walking containment breach. He had to suppress it. He closed his eyes and clenched his teeth, forcing his spiritual pressure inward, visualizing a steel door slamming shut on a raging furnace. The air around him shimmered violently, the heat distortion visible to the naked eye as he fought to contain the ocean of power inside a teacup. He managed to pull it back slightly, the crushing weight lifting just enough that the rock stopped pulverizing instantly, but he knew it was a temporary fix. He was leaking radiation, and he had no lead shielding. High above the wasteland, Piccolo hovered, his arms crossed over his chest, his cape snapping in the wind. His Namekian physiology was screaming at him, warning him of a predator that defied classification. He had felt Frieza's cold malice cells' calculated perfection and Buu's chaotic hunger. But this was different. This intruder did not feel like a warrior. He felt like a natural disaster. There was no key signature to lock onto no recognizable energy frequency that Piccolo could measure against his own. It was just a void, a heavy, crushing emptiness that made the bile rise in Piccolo's throat. He watched the orange-haired figure down below dragging a black blade through the desert. The boy looked human, but the way the world bent around him suggested he was anything but. Piccolo decided to test the waters before committing to a strike. He descended slowly, landing 50 feet away from the intruder, with a heavy thud that cracked the hardpan. The sound was a deliberate challenge, a way to announce his presence and gauge the reaction. Ichigo stopped moving, but he did not turn around. The black coat he wore, tattered and moving with an ethereal wind, seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Piccolo narrowed his eyes, analyzing the stance. The boy was open, full of gaps, holding his weapon, with a looseness that implied either amateurish negligence or absolute arrogant mastery. Piccolo spoke, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a guardian who had seen gods and monsters fall. He demanded to know the identity of the trespasser and why the planet itself seemed to be rejecting his presence. Ichigo turned his head, slowly looking over his shoulder, with a scowl that was more exhausted than menacing. The brown eyes that met Piccolo's gaze were heavy, ancient, in a way that did not match the youthful face. Ichigo simply told the green man to stay back, warning him that getting closer would be a bad idea. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact delivered with the weary tone of a man who was tired of breaking things. Piccolo was not accustomed to being dismissed. He uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, his combat instincts flaring. He told the boy that he was trespassing in a restricted sector and that he needed to identify himself immediately or be removed. Ichigo fully turned, then shifting his body so he was facing Piccolo, but he still didn't raise his sword. He looked at Piccolo's green skin and the antennae, and for a split second confusion replaced the exhaustion on his face, but he shook it off. He asked Piccolo where they were, asking if this was the world of the living or some layer of hell he hadn't seen before. The question annoyed Piccolo. It sounded like feigned ignorance. The Namekian flared his ki, a bright white aura erupting around him, kicking up dust and sending a shockwave rolling across the plateau. It was a display of power meant to intimidate, meant to force the opponent to reveal their own power level in response. But Ichigo did not power up. He did not flare a matching aura. Instead, he flinched. He looked physically pained by the light shielding his eyes with his free hand. To Ichigo, who sensed spiritual pressure rather than life energy, Piccolo's Kai flare was like a flashbang going off in a dark room. It was bright, hot, and blindingly loud, but it lacked the crushing spiritual gravity Ichigo was used to. It was all surface tension and explosive force with no density. Ichigo gritted his teeth and told Piccolo to turn it off, claiming it was too bright. Piccolo, seeing the reaction, assumed the intruder was weak to light, or perhaps hiding a weakness. He vanished, leaving an after-image seizing the initiative. He reappeared instantly behind Ichigo, driving a chop toward the boy's neck meant to incapacitate, not kill. The contact never happened. Piccolo's hand stopped 3 inches from Ichigo's neck, hitting an invisible wall of viscosity. It wasn't a force field. It was the air itself. Ichigo's Reiatsu was so dense immediately around his body that moving through it was like trying to punch through drying concrete. Piccolo's eyes widened in shock. In that microsecond of hesitation, Ichigo moved. He didn't fly, and he didn't use the high-speed movement Piccolo knew. He simply ceased to exist at point A and existed at point B. It was Shunpo, the flash step. Ichigo reappeared 10 yards away, giving himself space. He looked at Piccolo with annoyance, asking why he had attacked. Piccolo looked at his own hand. The skin was red, stinging, as if he had dipped it in acid. The passive aura of this boy was corrosive to living tissue. This was a biological threat, as much as a martial one. Piccolo realized that physical engagement was dangerous. He extended his hand palm facing outward and charged a ki blast. A sphere of concentrated energy formed, glowing with deadly intensity. He fired. The blast streaked across the distance, closing the gap in a fraction of a second. Ichigo didn't dodge. He raised the black blade with a lethargy that belied the speed of the swing. He didn't block the blast. He cut it. The Zangetsu sliced through the core of the ki sphere, disrupting the energy matrix. The blast didn't explode. It unraveled, splitting into 2 harmless arcs of light that fizzled out into the ground behind Ichigo. Piccolo stared. That was impossible. Kai was not a solid object to be cut. It was pure energy. To cut it meant the sword was interacting with the fundamental structure of the energy itself. Ichigo lowered the sword and sighed. He told Piccolo that he didn't want to fight, and that he just needed to figure out where he was so he could go home. He explained that his presence here was an accident. Piccolo, however, was a tactician who believed in actions over words. A being who could cut energy blasts and corrode skin with their aura was a planetary threat, regardless of their stated intentions. Piccolo tapped 2 fingers to his forehead, telepathically broadcasting a warning to the other Z fighters. He told them to stay back but to be ready. He sensed Gohan was the nearest studying at the Università in Satan City, but he told his student to keep his distance. This enemy was toxic. Piccolo decided to escalate to ranged attacks to test the boy's durability. He fired a volley of energy spheres, rapid fire covering the area in a grid of explosions. Ichigo was swallowed by the smoke and fire. The ground shook violently, the shockwaves tearing up the landscape. Piccolo ceased fire, watching the smoke plume, waiting for a key signature to drop or spike. There was nothing. The smoke cleared. Ichigo was standing in the same spot, but he had raised his left hand. A faint, translucent red hexagonal barrier was fading in front of his palm. He had used a low-level Bakudo spell to shield his face from the dust, but the blasts themselves hadn't seemed to damage him. His clothes were slightly more torn, singing the edges of the black fabric, but his skin was unmarred. The physical heat and concussive force of ki were effective, but Ichigo's spiritual density acted as armor. The blasts were hitting him, but they weren't penetrating the layer of Reiatsu that coated his skin. It was like throwing water balloons at a tank. Ichigo looked at his sleeve, scowling at the scorch mark. He muttered that he only had 1 spare Shihakusho, and the captain commander was going to kill him if he came back looking like a ragged stray dog again. He looked up at Piccolo and his expression hardened. The weariness was replaced by a sharp, focused intent. He told Piccolo that he was done standing there and letting himself be used for target practice. The air pressure suddenly dropped. The gravity in the area doubled, then tripled. Piccolo's knees buckled. He gasped, finding it hard to breathe. It wasn't a technique. Ichigo was simply letting go of the restraint he had been holding. He was preparing to fight back, and his preparation alone was warping the environment. The sheer dread that washed over Piccolo was primal. It was the feeling of a prey animal realizing it is in a cage with a predator that it cannot see. Ichigo raised Zangetsu high above his head. The blade began to hum, a sound that vibrated in Piccolo's teeth. Dark energy darker than night began to pool around the blade, wrapping it in chaotic swirling ribbons of black and red. It wasn't Kai. It felt like the void Piccolo had sensed earlier compressed into a razor's edge. Ichigo swung the blade down, whispering the name of the attack. Getsuga Tensho. The wave of energy that released was not a sphere or a beam. It was a crescent moon of absolute destruction that tore through the air with a shriek that sounded like 1,000 souls screaming in unison. Piccolo dodged instinct screaming at him that blocking was impossible. He threw himself to the left, narrowly avoiding the black wave. The attack struck the mountain range behind where Piccolo had been standing. There was no explosion. The mountains simply parted. A clean diagonal canyon appeared through 3 consecutive peaks. The rock vaporized so completely that there was no debris, just a smooth glass-like surface where the matter had been erased. The attack continued upward, slicing into the clouds and dissipating into the upper atmosphere, leaving a permanent scar in the sky. Piccolo hovered in the air, staring at the destruction. The precision and the silence of the cut were more terrifying than any explosion. If that had hit him, he would have been bisected. His regeneration would not have saved him because there would have been nothing left to regenerate. He looked back at Ichigo. The boy was breathing heavily, the attack having cost him some stamina, but he looked ready to swing again. This was a monster. Suddenly, the air crackled with a new arrival. A golden aura flared into existence between Piccolo and Ichigo, pushing back the heavy weight of Ichigo's pressure with sheer explosive force. Vegeta stood there, his arms crossed, his Super Saiyan hair blazing like a beacon. He had ignored Piccolo's warning, of course. The Prince of all Saiyans did not hide from threats, he confronted them. Vegeta looked at the destruction of the mountains, and then sneered at Ichigo. He called the attack impressive for a parlor trick, but noted that the boy's stance was amateurish. Vegeta demanded to know if this was the best the intruder had to offer, or if he was hiding his true power. Ichigo looked at the new arrival and groaned. He rubbed his temples, feeling a migraine coming on. He asked if everyone on this planet had yellow hair and yelled a lot. Vegeta's eyebrow twitched. The insult was casual, unintentional, and therefore unforgivable. Vegeta didn't bother with a warm-up. He launched himself at Ichigo, breaking the sound barrier instantly. His fist, wreathed in golden ki, connected with the flat of Ichigo's blade as the Shinigami raised it to block. The impact created a crater 100 meters wide. The clash of systems was violent and immediate. Vegeta's ki was explosive, pushing outward, trying to blow Ichigo away. Ichigo's Reiatsu was heavy, anchoring him down, trying to crush Vegeta into the dirt. They were immovable object and unstoppable force. Vegeta was faster physically. His combat speed in close quarters was superior, his fists a blur of motion that Ichigo struggled to track with his eyes alone. Ichigo relied on his sensory reflexes, reacting to the intent of the attacks rather than the image. He parried, deflected, and dodged using Shunpo to create distance whenever Vegeta got too close. But Vegeta was relentless. He pursued, sensing the displacement of air, even if he couldn't sense Ichigo's energy. Vegeta landed a solid kick to Ichigo's ribs. There was a sickening crack. Ichigo went flying, tumbling across the wasteland and crashing through a boulder. He lay there for a moment, coughing up blood. His iron skin, his blood vein equivalent, was strong, but Vegeta's physical strength was planetary. The blow had bypassed the spiritual defense simply by hitting hard enough to rattle the internal organs. Ichigo wiped his mouth. He was hurt, real pain. This was good. Pain focused him. It woke him up. Vegeta laughed, floating above the debris. He mocked Ichigo, telling him that for all that heavy atmospheric pressure, he was soft in the middle. He raised his hand, charging a big bang attack. The sphere of energy grew massive, crackling with electricity. He intended to finish this nuisance and get back to training. Ichigo stood up. His eyes changed. The whites turned black. The irises glowed gold. He reached up and touched his face, his hand making a claw shape. White bone began to form, manifesting from nowhere, spreading across his skin. A mask. The hollow mask snapped into place with a hiss of steam. The spiritual pressure in the area shifted. It was no longer just heavy. It was malicious. It was wild. The red and black aura around Ichigo exploded upward into a pillar of light that pierced the heavens. Vegeta paused the big bang attack held in his hand. For the first time, the Saiyan Prince felt a chill run down his spine. The energy he was looking at wasn't just power. It was hunger. Ichigo roared a sound that was two voices layered over each other, one human and one distorted beast. He vanished. He was instantly in front of Vegeta. The speed had doubled. Vegeta barely had time to widen his eyes before Zangetsu slammed into his guard. The force of the blow knocked Vegeta out of the sky, spiking him into the ground with enough force to cause a tectonic tremor. The big bang attack misfired, exploding harmlessly in the upper atmosphere. Ichigo hovered where Vegeta had been, the hollow mask staring down blank and terrifying. He raised his sword again, charging a black Getsuga. The energy was condensing, becoming a singularity on the tip of the blade. But before he could swing, a third figure appeared. Not with a boom, not with a flash, but with a soft rustle of fabric. A hand in an orange guy reached out and gently grasped Ichigo's wrist. It was not a grip of force, but of firm redirection. Ichigo looked down. Son Goku was there in his base form looking serious. He didn't look at the mask or the sword. He looked into the eye holes of the mask directly at Ichigo. He asked Ichigo to stop saying that the planet couldn't take much more of this. Ichigo froze. It wasn't Goku's strength that stopped him, though the grip was unshakable. It was the lack of hostility. Goku had no killing intent. His aura was calm like a still lake. It confused the hollow instincts which relied on aggression to fuel the fight. The dissonance caused Ichigo to hesitate. In that moment of hesitation, the mask cracked. It shattered, falling away in shards of white bone, revealing Ichigo's face beneath sweating and pale. The black aura dissipated, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Ichigo pulled his wrist free from Goku's grip and stumbled back, panting. He looked at Goku, then at the crater where Vegeta was climbing out looking murderous, then at Piccolo, who was watching from a distance. Ichigo lowered his sword. The adrenaline crash hit him all at once. The dimensional travel, the constant leakage, the fight with two planetary warriors. His vision blurred. He muttered an apology, collapsing forward. Goku caught him before he hit the ground. The Saiyan hoisted the heavy unconscious Shinigami over his shoulder. Vegeta flew up, wiping blood from his lip, demanding Goku hand over the intruder so he could finish the fight. Goku shook his head, his face grim. He told Vegeta that this wasn't a fight they could win by punching. He told them that when he touched the boy, he didn't feel ki. He felt a hole that led somewhere else. And he was terrified that if they hit him too hard, they might fall into it. The wind howled across the wasteland, carrying the dust of the pulverized mountains. The Z-fighters stood in the aftermath of a skirmish that had lasted less than 10 minutes, but had permanently altered the geography of the sector. They had a prisoner who defied their laws of physics, a boy who was heavy with death, and who carried a sword that cut through the fabric of their reality. And somewhere deep in the vibration of the earth, a new frequency began to hum, a resonance caused by the prolonged exposure of the Dragon Ball universe to the foreign spiritual pressure of a soul reaper. The boundary between the living world and the other world was beginning to thin. In the distance, the sky turned a bruised purple as the first cracks in the dimensional barrier began to form, letting in the cold air of the precipice world. Ichigo had arrived, and he had brought the logic of the Soul Society with him, infecting the timeline like a virus. Goku looked at the unconscious boy and then at the cracking sky. He said they needed to get to the lookout immediately. They needed Kami. But as they flew off, none of them noticed the small black butterfly that fluttered out of the folds of Ichigo's tattered clothing. It was a hell butterfly, and it beat its wings against the alien air, signaling a path for whatever was waiting on the other side. The first contact was over. The contamination had begun. The silence on Kami's lookout was usually a serene and rarefied thing, a peace born of high altitude and divine purpose. But today, it was the silence of a holding cell before a riot. The tiles of the sanctuary floor vibrated with a low-frequency hum that did not come from the wind or the earth, but from the body of the teenager lying on the simple cot that Mr. Popo had materialized. Ichigo Kurosaki was unconscious, but his presence was not. Even in sleep, his spiritual pressure radiated outward in slow, rhythmic waves that felt like the tide coming in heavy and relentless. Every time he exhaled, the air in the room grew denser, causing the wooden furniture to creak and the glass in the windows to rattle in their frames. Kami stood by the doorway, his ancient hands gripping his staff so tightly that his knuckles were white. He was the guardian of Earth, and he had felt many things in his centuries of existence, from the chaotic malice of Demon King Piccolo to the cold mechanical emptiness of the androids. But he had never felt a soul that was so fundamentally heavy. It was not evil, but it was vast, and it was completely unanchored. The boy was a singularity of spiritual mass, and his mere existence on this plane was warping the local reality. The birds that usually nested in the trees of the sanctuary had all died falling from the branches with their hearts stopped by the sheer pressure. Mr. Popo was sweeping them up in silence, his usually impassive face marked by a deep frown. Goku sat cross-legged on the floor nearby watching Ichigo with an intensity that was rare for him outside of battle. He had eaten a senzu bean to recover from the brief scuffle, but he hadn't touched the bags since. He was trying to understand what he was looking at. To his senses, the boy was a paradox. He had a physical body, one that was bruised and battered, but beneath that shell was a roaring furnace of energy that didn't follow the rules of Kai. Kai was life force. It was warm and explosive and connected to the body's vitality. This energy was cold. It felt like the chill of the grave amplified 1,000,000,000 times. It was the energy of death, but it was fighting to protect life. Goku looked at his own hands, remembering the feeling of stopping Ichigo's sword. It hadn't felt like stopping a punch. It felt like stopping a falling building. The mass was spiritual, not physical. Vegeta leaned against a pillar in the shadows, his arms crossed and his eyes closed, though he was not sleeping. He was seething. The Prince of Saiyans was insulted by the mystery. He could not sense the boy's power level, which meant he could not quantify the threat, and that made him furious. He wanted to wake the intruder up and beat the answers out of him, but Goku had insisted on waiting. Suddenly, Ichigo gasped. It was a sharp, desperate intake of air, as if he had been drowning. He sat up violently, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of Zangetsu, which lay propped against the wall. His eyes were wide and wild, scanning the room for threats. He saw Goku, and the tension in his shoulders spiked. He saw Vegeta, and the spike turned into a defensive crouch. Then he saw Kami, and he froze. He stared at the green skin and the wrinkled face, and for a moment he looked confused. He asked where he was and why the old man looked like the one he had fought earlier, but older. Kami stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. He explained that they were in the sanctuary of God, high above the earth, and that the warrior Ichigo had fought earlier was Piccolo, his other half. Ichigo rubbed his head, wincing as a headache throbbed behind his eyes. He muttered that splitting souls was a dangerous business and that they shouldn't mess with things they didn't understand. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and tried to stand, but his knees buckled. The gravity of the lookout was normal, but his own internal equilibrium was shot. Goku was there in an instant, offering a hand to steady him. Ichigo looked at the hand, then at Goku's face. He didn't take the hand, but he didn't slap it away either. He used the wall to support himself and asked simply how long he had been out. Goku answered that it had been about 3 hours. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small pouch. He offered Ichigo a senzu bean, explaining that it would heal his injuries and restore his stamina. Ichigo looked at the dried green bean with skepticism. In his world, healing was a complex art involving Kaido spells or the slow regeneration of reishi. A bean seemed ridiculous, but his ribs were aching and his lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. He took the bean and chewed it. The effect was instantaneous. The bruising on his chest vanished. The cracked ribs knitted together with a series of audible pops. His energy reserves, which had been dangerously low, flooded back to full capacity. And that was the problem. As soon as Ichigo's stamina was restored, his suppression broke. The dampener he had been unconsciously applying to his Reiatsu shattered under the sudden influx of vitality. The pressure in the room skyrocketed. The windows blew out, exploding outward in a shower of glass. The stone floor cracked spiderwebs of fissures racing away from Ichigo's feet. Kami fell to his knees, gasping for air as the atmospheric weight crushed him. Vegeta was forced to brace himself against the pillar, his aura flaring gold just to withstand the passive wave of force. Goku was pushed back his boots, skidding on the tiles. It wasn't wind, it was presence. Ichigo realized what was happening and panicked. He clamped his hands over his chest, trying to bottle it back up. He shouted for them to get back, warning them that he couldn't control it. The atmosphere of this world was too thin. It didn't offer any resistance to his power, so it just poured out of him like water from a burst dam. He squeezed his eyes shut, visualizing the steel doors of his inner world slamming them shut one by one. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure receded. It didn't disappear, but it became bearable. It was like standing next to a humming transformer rather than inside a reactor core. Ichigo leaned against the wall, sweating profusely. He looked at the devastation he had caused just by being healed, and he looked horrified. He apologized, his voice hoarse. He explained that his body wasn't adapted to this dimension. In the Soul Society, the air was made of spirit particles that acted as a buffer. Here, the air was empty. There was nothing to hold him in. He was a deep-sea creature brought to the surface, and he was exploding. Vegeta scoffed, stepping over the broken glass. He accused Ichigo of lacking discipline, claiming that power without control was useless. Ichigo shot him a glare, but didn't argue. He knew the Saiyan was right in principle, but the mechanics were wrong. It wasn't about discipline. It was about physics. Before the conversation could continue, a voice boomed in Goku's head. It was King Kai, and he sounded frantic. The voice was so loud that Goku winced. King Kai screamed for Goku to listen. He said that something catastrophic was happening at the check-in station in the other world. King Yama was in a panic. The line of souls waiting for judgment, which usually stretched for miles and moved with bureaucratic efficiency, had stopped. The souls were not moving, they were changing. King Kai explained that a strange corruption was spreading through the lines of the dead. Spirits that had been waiting peacefully were suddenly screaming, clutching their chests and transforming into monsters with white masks. The ogres who worked at the station were being overrun. The power of the great King Yema, which usually kept the dead in line, was ineffective against these new creatures. King Kai said the disruption was resonating from a source on Earth and was bleeding into the afterlife. He asked Goku what he had done. Goku relayed the message to the room, his face turning pale. Ichigo went rigid. He asked Goku to repeat the description of the monsters. Goku described the white masks and the holes in their chests. Ichigo's face lost all color. He whispered the word hollow. He explained rapidly that his arrival must have punched a hole in the boundary between dimensions. The Garganta, the void between worlds, was leaking. And worse, the ambient, spiritual energy of this world, which was massive and unregulated, was acting as a catalyst. In his world, souls that stayed too long without crossing over became hollows. In this world, where dead people kept their bodies and waited in line, the rules were different. But Ichigo's presence had imposed his world's rules on theirs. The souls at the check-in station were undergoing hollowification because they were being exposed to the radiation of Ichigo's home dimension. And if they turned into hollows in the other world, they would tear the afterlife apart. But the horror was not limited to the other world. Kami suddenly cried out, clutching his head. He could see the earth below, and he saw the corruption spreading from the site where Ichigo had first landed. The dust from the impact, the pulverized rock that had been saturated with Ichigo's Reiatsu, was drifting on the wind. Wherever it landed, it was infecting the local spirits. The Dragon Ball Earth was full of spirits, ghosts of the past minor demons' lingering regrets. Usually, they were harmless background noise, but the dust was acting as a mutagen. Down in the wasteland, near the impact crater, the ground began to boil. Dark, viscous sludge seeped up from the cracks in the earth, coalescing into shapes. They were not just the spirits of humans. The violent, aggressive spirits of the dinosaurs and beasts of the wasteland were being twisted. Ichigo grabbed Zangetsu. He told them he had to go. He explained that hollows were predators that ate souls. If they weren't stopped, they would devour every living thing in the area and then move to the cities. Goku said he was coming too. Vegeta, seeing a chance to actually fight something tangible, flew out the window without a word. Piccolo, who had been meditating on the roof, joined them. The four warriors dove from the lookout, plummeting through the clouds toward the wasteland below. As they descended, the scale of the catastrophe became visible. The wasteland was no longer a desert of rock and sand. It was a writhing sea of black mud. From this mud, hundreds of creatures were pulling themselves free. They were grotesque nightmare versions of the local fauna. There were saber-toothed tigers with white bone masks and gaping holes in their spines. There were pterodactyls with skeletal wings that dripped black ichor. And standing in the center of the swarm were humanoid figures, tall and spindly, with long arms and masks that looked like screaming skulls. The noise was deafening, a chorus of wails and shrieks that grated on the soul. The Z fighters stopped in the air, hovering above the horde. Yamcha, Tien, and Krillin were already there, having sensed the disturbance. They were engaged in combat, firing ki blasts into the mass of monsters. Krillin launched a destructo disc, slicing a massive mammoth-like hollow in half. The two halves fell into the mud, but then writhing tendrils of black energy shot out from the wound and pulled the body back together. The mask snapped back into place and the beast roared, firing a red beam of energy, a kero, from its mouth. Krillin barely dodged the beam, vaporizing a mountain behind him. He yelled to Goku that these things wouldn't die. They had blown them up, burned them, and cut them, but they kept regenerating. Ichigo landed in the center of the fray, his boots splashing into the black mud. He shouted to the others to stop attacking. He explained that they couldn't kill a hollow with raw damage. They had to purify it. They had to cut the mask. Goku landed beside him, kicking a lizard hollow away. He asked what that meant. Ichigo didn't have time to give a lecture. He surged forward, moving faster than the eye could follow. He targeted the mammoth hollow that Krillin had failed to kill. He didn't try to blow it up. He leapt onto its back, ran up its spine, and brought Zangetsu down in a vertical arc, striking the center of the bone mask. The mask cracked. Light poured out of the fissure. The beast didn't explode. It dissolved. The black body turned into dust, and a small glowing ball of light, the purified soul, floated up into the sky, disappearing into the ether. The Z fighters watched in stunned silence. Ichigo turned to them and told them that they were fighting souls, not biology. Their energy attacks were just damaging the vessel, but the corruption remained. He told them to aim for the masks. If they broke the mask, the soul could be saved. If they destroyed the body completely without breaking the mask, the soul might be destroyed forever. Vegeta looked at the swarm. There were hundreds of them. He snarled that he didn't have time for surgical precision. He raised his hand and fired a volley of energy blasts, aiming for the heads of the monsters. His aim was true. He shattered a dozen masks in seconds. The hollows dissolved. Vegeta smirked, proving that brute force applied correctly still worked. But the victory was short-lived. The black mud beneath them began to swirl, spinning into a vortex. The defeated hollows, the ones that hadn't been fully purified, and the ambient reishi in the air were being sucked into a central point. The ground shook violently, cracking the tectonic plates. A massive hand made of bone and black muscle burst from the center of the vortex. It was the size of a skyscraper. A Menos Grande, a Jillian class, was forming. But this was not a normal Jillian. It was feeding on the supercharged life energy of the Dragon Ball Earth. It grew larger and larger, towering over the mountains. Its mask was a simple pointed nose interface, but its eyes were burning with a golden light that mimicked the Super Saiyan aura. It had adapted. The Gillian opened its mouth and the air began to scream. Red light gathered in its maw, compressing into a sphere of devastating power. A zero. But the scale was wrong. It was the size of a spirit bomb. Ichigo screamed for everyone to scatter. The beam fired. It didn't just burn the land, it erased it. The beam carved a trench through the continent, extending for hundreds of miles, vaporizing everything in its path. The shockwave knocked the Z-fighters out of the sky. Goku recovered first, flipping in midair and powering up to Super Saiyan. He looked at the devastation, and his face hardened. This was a threat to the planet. He looked at Ichigo, who was struggling to stand in the mud. Goku asked if he could kill it. Ichigo said yes, but he needed time to charge. Vegeta and Piccolo moved to intercept. They flew at the giant's head, firing full power blasts to distract it. The Jillian swatted at them, moving with terrifying speed for its size. It clipped Piccolo, sending him crashing into a canyon. Vegeta managed to weave through the fingers, blasting the mask, but his attacks were bouncing off. The mask was reinforced with a layer of dense spiritual pressure that acted like a force field. Vegeta roared in frustration, powering up to Super Saiyan Grade 2, trying to break through the defense. Down below, Ichigo held Zangetsu, with both hands pointing the blade at the giant. He closed his eyes, focusing every ounce of his leaking, unmanageable power into the blade. The black aura flared, screaming like a banshee. He needed a Getsuga Tensho strong enough to split the giant in half, but focused enough not to crack the planet's crust. It was a delicate balance he wasn't sure he could achieve. Goku landed beside him. He placed a hand on Ichigo's shoulder. He told Ichigo that he would help him aim. Goku placed his other hand on the flat of the blade. He wasn't adding ki. He was using his instant transmission focus to stabilize the spatial coordinates. He told Ichigo to fire when he was ready. Ichigo opened his eyes. They were glowing blue. He swung the blade. Getsuga Tensho. The blast was a razor-thin line of black light. It didn't fan out. It stayed concentrated, a beam of absolute severance. It struck the Jillian in the center of the mask. For a second, nothing happened. Then a hairline crack appeared running down the length of the giant's body. The Jillian shrieked a sound that shattered windows in cities 1,000 miles away. The monster split in half. The two halves dissolved into trillions of particles of light. It was beautiful and terrifying. But as the particles faded, they didn't ascend to heaven. They lingered. The air grew cold. The light particles turned grey. Instead of passing on, the sheer volume of purified souls released at once overwhelmed the local dimensional fabric. The sky above the wasteland cracked again. This time, it wasn't a tear. It was a shattering. The blue sky fell away, revealing a dimension of swirling purple miasma and jagged floating rocks. The gates of hell, the Bleach version, had opened, but they were overlapping with the red clouds of the Dragon Ball Otherworld. King Yema's desk was suddenly sitting in the middle of a rocky wasteland in the Soul Society. The check-in station had been partially teleported. The panic was absolute. On the battlefield, the Z fighters looked up. Through the hole in the sky, they could see the line of dead souls falling into the void. They could see the ogres running, and they could see something else. Large chains were shooting out of the purple miasma, anchoring themselves to the earth. The dimensions were merging. Ichigo dropped to his knees exhausted. He stared up at the hole in the reality. He whispered that it was worse than he thought. He hadn't just brought hollows. He had brought the logic of the convergence. The worlds were trying to occupy the same space, and they were destroying each other. A chain link the size of a house slammed into the ground next to Goku, crushing a tank that had been abandoned there. The chain pulled taut, vibrating with tension. The earth groaned. The planet was being reeled in. Vegeta landed next to them, his armor cracked. He looked at the chain, then at the sky. He asked what was happening. Ichigo looked at him with dead eyes. He said that the world of the living was being dragged into the Bankai. If they didn't stop it, Earth would be crushed between the dimensions, and the only way to stop it was to go up there and sever the connection. But to do that, they would have to enter the tear. They would have to leave the universe they knew and step into the chaos. Suddenly, a small figure appeared near the chain. It was Frieza. Not the living Frieza, but the dead one, complete with a halo over his head. He had fallen through the rift from hell. He looked around confused at first, then he saw Goku. A twisted smile spread across his face. He laughed, realizing that the prison of the afterlife had broken, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, other villains, Cell Nappa, the Ginyu Force, were pulling themselves out of the dimensional mud. The catastrophe wasn't just the hollows. The prison break had begun. The dead were returning, and they were infused with the same hollow corruption that had started the mess. Frieza raised a finger, charging a death beam, but the tip of the finger was covered in white bone. He had started to holophy. His power was spiking far beyond what it had been in life. Ichigo stood up using his sword as a crutch. He looked at the army of resurrected hollow-fied villains. He looked at Goku. He said they had a lot of work to do. Goku cracked his knuckles, a serious expression on his face. He said he was getting tired of bad guys who didn't know when to stay dead. The battlefield expanding to include the sins of the past, now wearing the masks of monsters. The first major catastrophe had arrived, and it had brought the dead with it. The timeline was no longer just disrupted. It was being rewritten by the nightmares of two universes. The sky continued to crack, and the chains tightened, pulling the worlds into a fatal embrace. The laughter that spilled from the throat of the resurrected Frieza was a sound that defied the natural acoustics of the earth. It was a wet, grinding noise like bones scraping against rusted metal, amplified by the hollow resonance of the mask that had fused to his face. The tyrant stood hovering above the cracked tectonic plates of the wasteland, his iconic purple and white bio-armor now warped by the intrusion of white skeletal plating that spiraled down his arms and legs. A halo flickered above his head, but it was not the golden ring of a purified spirit, allowed to keep its body. It was jagged and black, pulsing with a corrupt light that seemed to suck the color out of the surrounding air. Behind him, the Ginyu Force struck their poses, but their limbs were elongated and broken. Their joints snapped backward in grotesque angles that accommodated their new hollow physiology. Riku's hair was gone, replaced by a crown of spikes that wept dark fluid, and Jise's red skin was pale, stretched tight over a facial structure that was more beak than mouth. The blending of the dimensions had not just brought them back, it had evolved them into something that existed outside the cycle of life and death. They were dead, but they were hungry, and that hunger was a bottomless pit that terrified even the bravest of the Z fighters. Goku stared at his old enemy, feeling a bead of cold sweat roll down his temple. He had fought Frieza on Namek, He had seen him cut in half and blown up, and he had seen him in hell, but this was different. The ki he sensed from Frieza was massive, dwarfing the power the tyrant had possessed on the mech, but it was wrapped in that same suffocating heaviness that Ichigo carried. It was a shield of spiritual density that made the air around Frieza ripple like water. Goku tightened his sash and stepped forward, his Super Saiyan aura flaring to push back the encroaching darkness. He spoke calmly, telling Frieza that he didn't know how he had come back, but he was going back to hell. Frieza tilted his head, the motion smooth and predatory. The mask that covered the upper half of his face had no mouth, only vertical slits, where the eyes should be glowing with a crimson malice. He didn't speak with his vocal cords. The voice projected directly into their minds a telepathic violation that tasted like iron. Frieza thanked Goku for the reception, claiming that the boredom of hell had been excruciating, but this new power, this emptiness, was a gift. He raised a finger. The attack was instant. A beam of energy erupted from Frieza's fingertip. It was not the thin purple death beam of the past. It was a spiraling lance of red and black energy, a tero compressed into a laser. Goku dodged instinctively, snapping his head to the side. The beam grazed his cheek. It didn't burn him. It rotted the skin. Goku gasped, clutching his face as the flesh turned grey and crumbled into dust, leaving a raw, weeping wound that refused to close. The beam continued past him, striking a distant mountain range. The mountains didn't explode. They simply vanished, consumed by a sphere of black void that expanded silently and then collapsed, leaving nothing but a perfect spherical crater. The physics of the attack were wrong. It was erasure, not destruction. Goku looked at the blood on his hand. It wasn't red. It was turning black. The wound was infecting him. Vegeta didn't wait to analyze the injury. His warrior pride was already at its breaking point. He launched himself at Cell, who was hovering with his arms crossed, his perfect form marred by a massive hole in his chest where his generator used to be. Cell's wings had hardened into bone, and his tail ended in a jagged spike rather than a stinger. Vegeta screamed a war cry, his fist wreathed in maximum power. He slammed his punch into Cell's face. The impact created a shockwave that flattened the mud for miles, but Cell didn't move. Vegeta's fist was stopped by the white bone mask that now covered Cell's jaw. The Saiyan Prince's eyes widened. He had hit with enough force to crack a planet, but he hadn't even scratched the mask. Cell chuckled, the sound vibrating in Vegeta's bones. He grabbed Vegeta's wrist. The grip was crushing. Cell noted that Vegeta's energy was delicious but spicy. He threw Vegeta. The prince flew downward, crashing through the bedrock and burying himself 100 meters deep. Ichigo watched the chaos unfold, his mind racing. He was the only one who understood the mechanics of what was happening, but he was also the weakest link in terms of raw destructive output. The Dragon Ball warriors were nuclear weapons, but they were trying to punch ghosts. He shouted to them, his voice cutting through the roar of battle. He told them to stop trying to tank the hits. He explained that the attacks were attacking the soul directly. Hiero, the steel skin of the Arrancar, was protecting the villains. It wasn't physical durability, it was spiritual hardening. To cut them, they needed to match the density of the spirit pressure, not just the force of the blow. He needed to show them. He needed to create an opening. Ichigo gripped Zangetsu. He was exhausted, his reserves drained from the earlier fight and the dimensional breach, but he had no choice. He looked at Frieza, who was preparing another volley of those rotting death beams. Ichigo realized that in his base form, he was too slow to intercept them all. He needed speed. He needed compression. Ichigo raised his sword across his chest. He hooked his left arm through the crook of his right arm, grasping the blade. His spiritual pressure spiked, condensing inward. The massive, chaotic ocean of power that had been crushing the area suddenly vanished, sucked into a singularity. The air grew still. The dust stopped moving. Frieza paused, sensing the shift. He looked at the orange-haired boy. Ichigo whispered the word, Bankai. The release was not an explosion. It was an implosion. A pillar of black wind tore into the sky, spinning with the force of a tornado. The ground beneath Ichigo's feet vaporized in a perfect circle. When the wind cleared, Ichigo stood there changed. He was no longer wearing the tattered shihakusho. He wore a sleek, long-sleeved black coat with a high collar, the inside lined with crimson. In his hand was not a giant cleaver, but a long, thin black katana. The chain at the hilt was broken, hanging loose. Tensa Zangetsu. By compressing his massive power into a small form, he maximized his speed. But on this world, the compression did something else. It stabilized his interaction with the environment. The heavy crushing gravity he had been emitting was gone, contained entirely within his body. He was no longer a leaking reactor. He was a focused laser. Frieza laughed, mocking the tiny sword. He fired a barrage of zero-death beams, a rain of red light meant to carpet bomb the area. Ichigo didn't move. He vanished. The sound of a bell tolling echoed across the battlefield. Clang, clang, clang. The beams were sliced in mid-air, the red energy dissipating into harmless sparks. Ichigo appeared in front of Frieza, the tip of his black blade resting against the center of Frieza's mask. Frieza blinked. He hadn't seen the movement. Even with his elevated power, the tyrant's eyes couldn't track the Shumpo enhanced by Bankai. Ichigo didn't speechify. He thrust. The black blade pierced the mask. It didn't go all the way through, blocked by the density of Frieza's own spiritual pressure, but it cracked the shell. Frieza shrieked, reeling back, clutching his face. Black steam poured from the crack. Goku, watching from below, realized what Ichigo had done. He hadn't used more power. He had used sharper power. He had condensed his ki to a pinpoint. Goku was a martial arts genius. He saw the principle instantly. He couldn't replicate the Bankai or the sword, but he could replicate the concept. He needed to stop throwing his ki around in wide explosions and focus it into a single point of impact. He looked at his hand. He concentrated. He pulled his aura in, tightening it around his skin until it was almost invisible. He wasn't suppressing his power. He was compressing it. It was painful. It felt like his skin was going to tear. But he held it. He flew up, joining Ichigo. The battle shattered into a series of high-speed collisions that the human eye could not have followed. Even the sensors in Dr. Jiro's old lab miles away would have failed to register the data. Ichigo and Goku fought back-to-back, a blur of black and orange against the army of nightmares. Ichigo focused on parrying and breaking the defenses, using his sword to slice through the Hiero of the Ginyu Force members, while Goku followed up with condensed physical strikes that shattered to the bone armor. Reiatsu fell, his chest cavity imploded by a focused punch from Goku. Berta was bisected by a black crescent moon from Ichigo. The purified souls floated up, but the sky was still torn, and the souls had nowhere to go. They hovered, confused and vulnerable, adding a layer of tragic white noise to the battlefield. But for every victory, the cost was mounting. Down on the ground, Krillin and Tien were losing. Nappa, who had returned as a hulking behemoth of bone and muscle, was tearing through their defenses. He didn't use technique. He used mass. He slammed Tien into the ground, breaking the Triclops' arm. Krillin fired a Destructo disc, but Nappa caught it. He caught the razor-sharp energy disc with his bare hand, the bone armor on his palm grinding against the ki until the disc shattered. Nappa roared, opening his mouth to devour Krillin. Suddenly, a flash of green light intervened. Piccolo landed, kicking Nappa in the jaw. The Namekian was breathing hard. He had been fighting his own battle against the mental intrusion. The merging of the other world meant that the Namekian ancestors were screaming in his head, their voices distorted by the corruption. Piccolo had to fight a war on two fronts, one physical and one psychological. He yelled at Krillin to retreat to get the wounded to safety. He claimed that this wasn't a fight for Earthlings anymore. Meanwhile, miles away in West City, Bulma Briefs was staring at a monitor that was screaming warnings in red text. The Capsule Corp lab was shaking, the seismic stabilizers working overtime to keep the building from collapsing. She wasn't looking at power levels. She was looking at dimensional drift frequencies. Her data showed that the Earth wasn't just being invaded. It was being digested. The specific vibration frequency of the planet was shifting, matching the resonance of the Soul Society. The laws of physics were being overwritten. Gravity was fluctuating. Time was dilating. And most terrifying of all, the Rishi density in the atmosphere was rising exponentially. Normal humans couldn't handle it. In the streets, people were collapsing, falling into comas, as their souls were subjected to pressure they weren't evolved to withstand. The hospitals were full, but there was no medical cure for spiritual crushing. Bulma realized with horror that if the density reached 100%, the entire human population would simply disintegrate their bodies, turning into dust to fuel the new reality. She grabbed a communicator, screaming for Vegeta, but all she got was static. The interference was total. She needed a way to reverse the polarity to push the dimensions apart. She looked at the schematic for the Dragon radar. It was useless. The Dragon Balls were stone. With Piccolo fighting and Kami in distress, the connection to the Dragon was unstable. But she had an idea. A desperate theoretical idea involving the gravity chamber and the dark matter engine she had been tinkering with. She started typing furiously, her hands shaking. Back on the battlefield, the situation was deteriorating. Cell had recovered from Vegeta's assault and was now dominating the fight. He had adapted. He had analyzed the spiritual energy and incorporated it. He wasn't just using Kai anymore. He was using Sonido. He was vanishing and reappearing with the static fuzz sound of an iron car. He appeared behind Vegeta, his tail lashing out. Vegeta dodged, but the tail grazed his armor. The armor turned grey and crumbled. Cell laughed, remarking that the Saiyan Prince was fighting a war of attrition he couldn't win. Cell began to charge a Kamehameha, but the energy wasn't blue. It was a swirling vortex of green and black. A Kero Kamehameha. He fired. Vegeta crossed his arms to block, but the blast was too heavy. It engulfed him, pushing him back, grinding him into the dirt. Vegeta roared his pride, refusing to let him fall, but he was being overwhelmed. Ichigo saw Vegeta falling. He broke away from Frieza, leaving Goku to handle the tyrant alone for a second. Ichigo flashed, stepping in front of Vegeta. He raised Tensor Zangetsu. He didn't block. He countered. He swung his sword upward, releasing a point-blank Getsuga Tensho. The black wave collided with the green beam. The explosion was cataclysmic. A mushroom cloud of mixed energy rose into the stratosphere. Ichigo was thrown back, skipping across the ground like a stone. He skidded to a halt, his coat smoking. He was bleeding from a dozen small cuts. The strain of maintaining Bankai in this heavy atmosphere was taking its toll. His bones ached, but he had saved Vegeta. The Saiyan Prince climbed out of the crater, his pride bruised more than his body. He looked at Ichigo with a mixture of hatred and respect. He spat blood and told the Earthling not to think this made them friends. Ichigo didn't look back. He just told Vegeta to shut up and keep fighting. Then the turning point happened. the moment that shifted the trajectory of the war from a desperate defense to a potential tragedy. Goku was fighting Frieza, trading blows in the sky. Frieza was getting frustrated. Goku's compressed style was effective. He was landing hits, cracking the armor. Frieza decided to gamble. He stopped blocking. He opened his arms wide, leaving his chest exposed. Goku, seeing the opening, drove his fist forward, aiming for the heart. It was a killing blow. But as his fist connected, Frieza didn't flinch. Instead, the bone armor on Frieza's chest opened like a bear trap. Ribs, made of white jagged bone, clamped down on Goku's arm, trapping him. Goku pulled, but he was stuck. Frieza smiled, the expression horrific on his mask. He leaned in close. He whispered that he had learned a new trick in the dark. A long spike of bone erupted from Frieza's chest, right beside Goku's trapped arm. It drove straight into Goku's shoulder. It wasn't a deep wound, but it wasn't meant to kill. The spike pulsed, pumping a thick black fluid into Goku's bloodstream. It was concentrated hollow ichor, the distilled essence of the corruption. Goku's eyes widened. He felt cold, a cold that started in his shoulder and raced to his heart. He kicked Frieza away, tearing his arm free, but the damage was done. He fell from the sky, crashing into the mud. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't work. The veins in his neck turned black. He coughed, and a cloud of white dust expelled from his mouth. Ichigo felt the shift immediately. Goku's ki, which had been a bright, warm sun, suddenly flickered and dimmed. Then it flared back up, but it was wrong. It was darker, heavier. Ichigo turned just in time to see Goku standing up. The Saiyan was clutching his face, his fingers digging into his skin. He was screaming. It was a scream of pure agony. White substance was spreading across his face, starting from the wound on his cheek and the injection site. It was forming a mask. Goku was undergoing hollowification. The strongest warrior on Earth, the beacon of hope, was being corrupted. The Z-fighters froze. Even the villains paused, sensing the change. Frieza laughed a high-pitching sound of triumph. He announced that the monkey was finally evolving. He claimed that soon Goku would be one of them, a monster driven only by hunger and battle. Ichigo stared in horror. He knew what happened when a soul underwent hollowification. The inner hollow took over, and Goku's inner instincts, his Saiyan lust for battle, amplified by the hollow's hunger, would create a monster that nothing in the universe could stop. If Goku turned, he would kill everyone. He would eat the planet. Ichigo made a choice. He abandoned the fight with Cell. He abandoned the defense of the wounded. He flashed to Goku's side. He grabbed Goku by the shoulders, shaking him. He shouted for Goku to fight it. He told him not to let the mask form. Goku looked at Ichigo, his eyes one teal and one turning yellow with a black sclera. He gritted his teeth, his voice a growl. He told Ichigo to run. He said he couldn't hold it back. The hunger was too strong. He wanted to bite. He wanted to tear. The white bone covered his nose, then his mouth. Vegeta landed nearby. He looked at his rival. He didn't offer comfort. He raised his hand, charging a big bang attack aimed right at Goku's head. He stated coldly that if Kakarot was gone, he would do the favor of putting him down before he shamed the Saiyan race. Ichigo knocked Vegeta's hand away, the blast firing harmlessly into the sky. Ichigo yelled that they could save him. He said that if Goku could conquer the inner hollow, he could control the power. It was what the Vizard had done. It was what Ichigo had done. But Goku had to do it now, in the middle of a war zone, with a corrupted soul. Suddenly, the sky tore open even wider. The chains that tethered the Earth to the other dimension tightened. A massive structure began to descend from the rift. It was a white tower, an inverted palace. Las Noches was bleeding through. The architecture of Huecomundo was superimposing itself onto the wasteland. From the balconies of this spectral palace, new figures emerged. They weren't resurrected villains. They were native Arancars drawn by the massive spiritual pressure. They looked down at the chaos at the feast of powerful souls. The situation had escalated beyond a simple invasion. It was a convergence of hells. Goku fell to his knees, roaring as the mask fully formed over his face, a single horn jutting from the forehead. His golden aura turned black. A vasto Lord roar erupted from him, shaking the foundations of the world. He was no longer Goku. He was a force of nature. He looked at Vegeta, then at Ichigo. He didn't recognize them. He only saw prey. Ichigo stepped back, raising his sword. His hands were shaking. He had to fight Goku. He had to fight the strongest warrior in the universe, who was now wearing a mask that granted him limitless brutality. And he had to do it while Frieza and Cell watched and laughed. The chain reaction was complete. The heroes were divided, the planet was dying, and the savior had become the destroyer. High above in the sanctuary, Mr. Popo watched the darkness spread. He turned to the empty pedestal where the Dragon Balls usually sat. They were grey, inert stone, but one of them, the 4-star ball, had a faint crack running down its center. A small pulse of black smoke escaped the crack. The corruption hadn't just hit the people. It had infected the dragon itself. The shadow dragons were waking up early, and they were hungry too. Ichigo looked at the monster that was Goku. He took a deep breath, centering his Reiatsu. He knew he couldn't hold back. If he wanted to save his friend, he had to beat him within an inch of his life. He tightened his grip on Tensho Zangetsu. He whispered to himself that this was going to hurt. He flared his Reiatsu, mixing it with his own hollow power, his eyes turning black and gold behind his own mask, which materialized in response to the threat. Monster versus monster. The battle for the soul of the earth began not with a bang, but with the sonic boom of two corrupted heroes colliding in the center of a dying world. The shockwave shattered the windows of the descending Las Noches. The image of their locked blades, one black metal, one glowing fist, silhouetted against the burning purple sky. There was no going back. The timeline was shattered. The air did not just vibrate, it shrieked. The sound was a constant high-frequency tear in reality caused by the collision of two beings who had forsaken the laws of physics for the raw, chaotic potential of destruction. Hollow Goku, now a creature of pure instinct and corrupted hunger, moved with a speed that made the concept of time irrelevant. He did not fly in the traditional sense. He tore holes in space using a bastardized fusion of instant transmission and sonido, appearing in flashes of black static that left after images burned into the retinas of the observers. Ichigo Kurosaki, in his Bankai state, struggled to keep up. His Tensho Zangetsu was a blur of midnight black parrying blows that were heavy enough to shatter tectonic plates. Every time Goku's fist connected with Ichigo's blade, a shockwave expanded outward, pulverizing the rock for miles and sending ripples of distorted gravity up into the descending spectral architecture of Las Noches. This was not a martial arts duel. There was no rhythm, no exchange of techniques, no testing of defenses. It was a mauling. Goku roared a sound that layered the guttural growl of a great ape over the metallic screech of a hollow. He fired a blast from his mouth at Zero that had been twisted by the mechanics of the Kamehameha. The beam was a spiraling drill of red and black energy that rotated at thousands of revolutions per second. Ichigo deflected it, barely angling his sword to slide the beam past his shoulder. The attack struck the horizon, and the curvature of the earth visibly flattened in the distance. Ichigo gritted his teeth behind his own mask. He was faster than Goku in linear movement, but Goku's combat instincts were preternatural. Even in this berserk state, the Saiyan's body knew how to fight. He was predicting Ichigo's angles before Ichigo even decided them. Vegeta watched from the mud, his armor hanging off his body in ruin. He spat a tooth onto the ground, his pride burning hotter than his injuries. He saw the pattern that Ichigo was missing. Kakarot was not just attacking, he was feeding. Every time they clashed, Goku drew in a breath of the reishi dense air, growing stronger, adapting to the spiritual pressure. If this continued, Goku would evolve again. He would become a being that could not be killed by anything in this universe. Vegeta forced himself to stand. His legs shook, but his will clamped down on his nervous system, forcing compliance. He flared his ki, which was now tinged with the grey, heavy static of the dimension, but he didn't care. He launched himself into the fray, intercepting Goku just as the monster prepared a finishing blow on Ichigo. Vegeta hammered a two-handed sledgehammer blow onto the top of Goku's masked head. The impact rang like a bell. Goku halted, his head snapping down. For a second, Vegeta thought he had reached him. He thought the bond of their rivalry, the decades of shared blood, would spark a memory. Goku slowly raised his head. The single horn on his mask pointed at Vegeta like an accusing finger. The eyes were void of recognition. Goku backhanded Vegeta. It was a casual, dismissive strike, but it carried the force of a collapsing star. Vegeta was sent skipping across the atmosphere, skipping off the air itself before crashing into the floating debris of the check-in station. He lay there gasping, his ribs pulverized. The tragedy was absolute. There was no rival left inside that shell. Only the hunger. Ichigo landed beside the crater where Vegeta had fallen. He was panting, his Reiatsu flickering. He realized the strategic futility of the situation. He couldn't cut Goku, not because he lacked the power, but because the mask had fused too deeply. The bone wasn't armor anymore. It was his skull. If Ichigo used a Getsuga Tensho powerful enough to break the mask, he would take Goku's head off. He looked at the devastation. Frieza and Cell were watching amused like vultures, waiting for the lions to kill each other. The Ginyu Force and the lesser Arrancars were tearing apart the landscape, closing in on the remaining human defenders. A choice had to be made, a choice that defied military logic, but adhered to the spiritual logic of a soul reaper. Ichigo turned to Vegeta, who was trying to crawl out of the debris. Ichigo spoke, his voice distorted by his mask, but clear in intent. He said he was going inside. Vegeta looked up, confusion warring with pain on his face. Ichigo explained rapidly. He couldn't win on the outside. The only way to stop the holification was to enter Goku's inner world and help his soul fight the parasite directly. He had done it for himself, and he could do it for Goku. But it required physical vulnerability. Ichigo would have to enter a meditative trance, Jinsen state, in the middle of a war zone. His body would be a statue, a defenseless beacon of massive spiritual power. Ichigo dropped to his knees, thrusting Zangetsu into the ground. He looked at Vegeta. He didn't ask if Vegeta could do it. He simply told him to keep them off him. It was a command born of necessity. Ichigo closed his eyes. His Reiatsu flared once, then inverted, sucking inward. He was gone from the physical plane, his consciousness diving into the spiritual link he had established when their blades clashed. Vegeta stood up. He was broken, bleeding, and exhausted. He was facing a berserk Kakarot, a resurrected Frieza, a super-evolved Cell, and an army of monsters. And now he had to protect the unconscious body of an intruder he barely knew. It was the most insulting, suicidal tactical position he had ever been in. A dark, twisted smile spread across Vegeta's face. He wiped the blood from his eye. He whispered that Kakarot owed him a planet for this. He flared his aura. It wasn't the bright gold of Super Saiyan. It was a deep, heavy gold stained by the atmosphere. He stood over Ichigo's body, acting as a living shield. Inside the soul, the landscape was a nightmare. Ichigo opened his eyes expecting to see the sideways skyscrapers of his own inner world or a water-filled plain. Instead, he stood on a jagged needle of rock in a world of endless storms. The sky was the color of dried blood. Lightning made of red ki struck the ground constantly. In the distance, a mountain range moved. It was not rock, it was fur. A golden great ape, the size of a continent, dominated the horizon. It roared, and the sound was the same scream Ichigo had heard outside. But chained to the needle of rock in front of Ichigo was a man. Goku, not the monster, but the man. He was small, battered, and wrapped in black chains that pulsed with hollow energy. He looked up at Ichigo, his eyes tired. He asked Ichigo why he was there. Ichigo walked forward, pulling a materialized sword from the air. He told Goku to get up. He cut the chains. The metal snapped, but the great ape in the distance roared, turning its massive head toward them. Its face was covered by a white mask. The inner demon was the primal Saiyan instinct fused with the hollow hunger. Goku rubbed his wrist looking at the giant. He said he couldn't beat it. It was too loud. It wanted to eat everything. Ichigo stood beside him. He said they didn't have to beat it. They just had to ride it. They had to accept the instinct but deny the hunger. Ichigo pointed his sword at the beast. He told Goku that in his world the horse didn't ride the king. Outside, the slaughter began. Frieza, seeing Ichigo sit down, decided the game was over. He pointed a finger, charging a death beam. Vegeta stepped into the line of fire. He didn't dodge. He swatted the beam away, his hand burning but his stance firm. Frieza narrowed his eyes. He ordered Cell to flank. Cell moved, vanishing with Sonido. He reappeared behind Ichigo's defenseless back, raising his tail to impale the boy. Vegeta moved faster than his injuries should have allowed. He tackled Cell, driving his shoulder into the bio-android's gut. They crashed into the mud. Cell kicked Vegeta off, sending him flying, but Vegeta rebounded using a ki blast to propel himself back to Ichigo's side. Hollow Goku, tired of the delay, charged. He aimed a punch at Ichigo's head. Vegeta caught the fist. The bones in Vegeta's arm shattered audibly. He screamed, his knees buckling under the weight of the monster, but he held on. He held the fist inches from Ichigo's face. He roared at Kakarot to wake up, calling him a clown, a fool, a failure. He poured every ounce of his remaining energy into a point-blank blast, pushing Goku back a few meters. But it wasn't enough. Frieza floated closer, bored. He raised his hand, creating a massive sphere of energy, a supernova. He intended to vaporize the entire plateau, Ichigo, Vegeta, and the monster included. This was the moment of the small choice leading to the massive outcome. But the choice was not Vegeta's. It was Gohan's. Gohan had arrived minutes ago. He had been watching from the ridge, frozen in terror. He saw his father turned into a demon. He saw the Z fighters broken. He saw the sky bleeding another dimension. The scholar, the pacifist, the boy who wanted to be a professor, was paralyzed by the sheer illogical horror of the scene. He was analyzing the energy, trying to find a scientific solution, trying to find a way to de-escalate. But as Frieza raised the supernova as Vegeta's arms broke, Gohan realized that logic had died. The world didn't need a scholar. It didn't need a Super Saiyan. It needed something that could survive in this hell. The atmosphere was critical. The reishi concentration was now 85%. The air was no longer air, it was spirit matter. Gohan's body, which had great potential, was acting like a sponge. He wasn't just breathing oxygen, he was breathing the essence of Hueco Mundo. As his emotional state fractured the latent power in his cells, the beast that had slept since the Cell Games woke up. But it woke up in a new environment. It didn't reach for the golden light of the Super Saiyan. That form burned energy. This environment required something that consumed energy. Gohan stepped off the ridge. He didn't fly. He walked. And with every step he took, he changed. The rage didn't explode outward. It imploded. His hair didn't turn gold. It turned white. Not the white of age, but the white of bone. His skin grew pale. The orange GI he wore seemed to fuse with his body, hardening, turning into a carapace. A mask began to form on his face, but it wasn't a separate piece. It grew out of his skin, covering his mouth, covering his nose, leaving only his eyes, which burned with a cold reptilian teal. Frieza sensed it first. He stopped the supernova, turning his head. He looked at the boy walking toward them. Frieza laughed, asking if another monkey had come to die. He fired a casual death beam at Gohan's chest. The beam struck Gohan. It didn't pierce. It splashed. The carapace on Gohan's chest absorbed the energy, drinking it. Gohan didn't break stride. Vegeta slumped to his knees, his arms useless. He looked at Gohan's son. He felt a chill that was colder than the void. This wasn't Kai. It was the pressure so dense it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Gohan stopped 10 meters from Frieza. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The mask covered his mouth. He simply looked at the tyrant. Frieza, annoyed by the lack of fear, threw the supernova. The massive ball of magma-colored energy descended. Gohan raised one hand. His fingers were tipped with long obsidian claws. He caught the supernova. He caught a moon-sized attack with one hand. The physics defied explanation. Gohan's claws dug into the energy sphere. The energy turned black, spreading from his fingertips like ink in water. He was infecting the attack with his own spiritual density. He clenched his fist. The supernova collapsed, crushed into a marble of black matter, then vanished. Frieza's jaw dropped. Cell stepped back, his computer brain failing to calculate the variable. Gohan vanished. He didn't use speed. He used displacement. He was instantly in front of Frieza. He grabbed Frieza by the face, his clawed hand encompassing the tyrant's mask. Frieza tried to fire a beam point blank. Gohan squeezed. The sound of Frieza's reinforced bio-armor cracking was sickeningly loud. Gohan slammed Frieza into the ground, but he didn't let go. He dragged him through the bedrock, moving towards Cell. Cell fired a Kamehameha. Gohan ignored it, walking through the beam, the energy parting around his carapace like water around a stone. He reached Cell and swung Frieza like a club, smashing the tyrant into the android. Both villains went tumbling into the mud. This was the inflection point. The massive outcome. Gohan had not achieved a new Super Saiyan form. He had achieved a native adaptation to the merged dimension. He was the first human Saiyan Arrancar hybrid born of environmental pressure. He was a creature of the new world, and he was utterly silent. Inside the soul, Ichigo and Goku fought the ape. They didn't use beams or blasts. They used will. Goku climbed the fur of the beast, screaming his defiance, reminding the instinct that it served him. Ichigo struck the mask of the ape with his sword, cracking it. The ape roared, thrashing, trying to shake them off. But the connection was made. Goku drove his fist into the crack in the mask. He didn't break it. He grabbed the edge and pulled. He pulled the mask off the ape's face. Beneath the mask was not a monster's face, but Goku's own face, screaming in rage. Goku stared at his own reflection. He realized the truth. The monster wasn't a parasite. It was him. It was the part of him that wanted to destroy. He had to accept it. He wrapped his arms around the massive neck of the ape and embraced it. The ape dissolved, turning into golden light that flooded Goku's small body. Ichigo watched as the storm cleared. The red sky turned a calm twilight blue. Goku stood there panting. The chains were gone. The mask was gone. But his eyes were different. They were sharper, predatory. He looked at Ichigo and nodded. He said he was ready. Ichigo opened his eyes in the real world. He gasped, pulling Zangetsu from the ground. He looked around. The landscape was unrecognizable. It was flattened. Vegeta was unconscious by his feet, and standing in the center of the battlefield was a white, armored monster, holding Frieza and Cell by their necks, choking the life out of them. Ichigo stood up shaky. He recognized the key signature buried deep under the armor. Gohan. Goku woke up a second later. The mask shattered, falling off his face in dust. He didn't roar. He stood up silently. His aura was no longer the wild, chaotic mess of the hollow. It was a perfect blend of gold and black, Super Saiyan infused with the predatory focus of the Vasto Lord. He looked at Vegeta, then at Ichigo. Then he looked at his son. Goku's eyes widened. He sensed the tragedy. Gohan had saved them, but he had lost himself in the process. The mask on Gohan's face was seamless. There was no crack to pull at. Frieza, struggling in Gohan's grip, managed to fire a desperate eye laser, cutting a shallow groove in Gohan's mask. Gohan reacted instantly. He ripped Frieza's arm off. Not with malice, but with the cold efficiency of an insect removing a threat. Frieza screamed a sound of genuine terror. Gohan prepared to finish him, to crush the tyrant's skull. "Gohan, stop!" Goku's voice rang out. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Gohan froze. He turned his head slowly toward his father. The teal eyes narrowed. For a moment the beast assessed the threat. Then the bond held. Gohan dropped Frieza, who scrambled away, clutching his stump. Gohan stood there, vibrating with pent-up aggression. He was a loaded gun with no safety. The battlefield fell silent. The immediate threat of the hollow Goku was gone, but it had been replaced by a darker reality. The Z fighters had survived, but they had been irrevocably changed. Goku was tainted, his soul forever marked by the hollow. Vegeta was broken physically and mentally humiliated. And Gohan was a monster. Bulma's voice finally cut through the static on Vegeta's earpiece. She sounded triumphant and terrified. She said the device was ready. She was going to activate the Reishi repeller. It would push the dimensions apart. It would send the Las Noches structure and the spectral atmosphere back to where it belonged. But she warned them. Anyone with a high density of Reishi in their cells might be pulled with it. Ichigo looked at his hand. He was fading. The dimension was rejecting him. He looked at the villains. The resurrected bad guys were screaming as the retreating dimension grabbed them, dragging them back to hell. Frieza, Cell, and the Ginyu Force were pulled into the sky, clawing at the ground, but the gravity of the void was absolute. But Gohan began to float too. The white armor, the carapace, was made of Reishi. He belonged to the other side now. Goku lunged, grabbing Gohan's ankle. He anchored himself, digging his boots into the bedrock. He shouted that he wouldn't let go. Ichigo grabbed Gohan's other arm. They held on as the sky roared, trying to reclaim its creation. The wind was deafening. The castle of Las Noches receded, the chains snapping one by one. The purple sky began to peel away, revealing the blue beneath. But the damage to the timeline was done. As the pressure normalized, Gohan fell to the ground. The armor didn't disappear. It cracked and receded, retracting into his skin like a dormant virus. But it didn't vanish. He was left panting, pale and changed. The dimension had separated, but it had left its fingerprints on the DNA of the Earth's protectors. Ichigo didn't vanish. The device pushed the bulk of the dimension back, but Ichigo was a living singularity. He was too dense to be moved by a machine. He remained stranded on a world that was now terrified of him. The survivors standing in the ruins. There was no celebration. Only the realization that to defeat monsters they had become them. The Dragon Balls were stone. The sky was scarred. And somewhere in the silence a new threat began to tick. The cracked 4-star ball finally shattered. From the shards a dark dragon emerged, small and smoke-like, unnoticed in the aftermath. The shadow dragons were here, and they were born not just from the overuse of wishes, but from the corruption of the wish-granters themselves. The era of the Dragon Ball was over. The era of the Hollow Moon had begun. The silence that followed the closure of the dimensional rift was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a vacuum. The air pressure had normalized, and the purple scar in the sky had been sutured shut by the retreating gravity of the Hueco Mundo dimension. But the world that remained was grey and drained. The color seemed to have been leached from the landscape, leaving the rocks and the soil a uniform shade of ash. Ichigo Kurosaki stood amidst the ruins of the wasteland, his body heavy with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle. He was no longer leaking Reiatsu. The separation of the worlds had cauterized his spiritual pores, leaving him feeling hollowed out and strangely mortal. He looked at his hands, which were trembling not from fear, but from the sheer metabolic crash of sustaining Bankai in a hostile environment for so long. Beside him, Goku sat on a flat rock, his head bowed. The Saiyan's gi was torn to shreds, and the skin on his face where the mask had been was raw and pink like a fresh burn. The corruption had receded, but it had not left him unchanged. There was a darkness in Goku's eyes, a shadow of the instinct that had seized him, that did not disappear with the mask. He looked at his son. Gohan stood 100 yards away, his back to them. The white carapace that had formed over his body had retracted, but it had not vanished. It had settled under his skin, forming a subdermal armor that made his shoulders look too broad and his movements too stiff. He did not speak. He did not power down. He stood like a sentinel watching the pile of grey stones that had once been the Dragon Balls. The spheres were dead. They did not pulse. They did not glow. They looked like fossilized eggs left in the sun too long. But then a sound cracked the silence. It was the sound of porcelain snapping under pressure. A hairline fracture appeared on the surface of the 1-star ball. Then another on the 4-star ball. It was not a clean break. It was a rotting. The stone began to flake away, revealing not the golden light of the eternal dragon, but a viscous black sludge that oozed out onto the hardpan. Bulma's voice crackled over the communicator, her tone bordering on hysteria. She was reading energy spikes that defied the classification of the previous invasion. This was not hollow energy, and it was not Kai. It was negative potential. It was the accumulated entropy of every wish made in the last 50 years, corrupted by the recent influx of hollow Reiatsu. The sludge on the ground began to bubble. It hissed, releasing a gas that smelled of ozone and sulfur. The Z fighters, who were barely standing, forced themselves into combat stances. Vegeta spat blood on the ground, his left arm hanging useless at his side. He glared at the oozing Dragon Balls with a look of supreme betrayal. He had spent his life chasing those orbs, fighting for them, dying for them. And now they were hatching into something that felt like the end of the world. The sludge did not form 7 distinct dragons. The corruption was too absolute for that. The individual personalities of the shadow dragons had been dissolved by the chaotic influence of the hollow particles. Instead, The black liquid pooled together, swirling into a vortex that rose upward into a single towering column. From this column, a shape emerged. It was skeletal, white, and massive. It resembled the structure of a Menos Grande, but it possessed the horns and the whiskers of Shenron. It was a mockery of the divine dragon. Its scales were white bone plates, and its eyes were empty sockets that wept black ichor. In the center of its chest, all 7 cracked dragon balls were embedded in a circle, glowing with a sickly violet light. This was not Omega Shenron. This was Hollow Shenron, a being born of the death of hope. The creature did not roar. It inhaled. The sound was deafening, a sudden drop in pressure that pulled the air, the dust, and the light itself into its gaping maw. The environment began to decay. The rocks turned to sand. The sand turned to nothing. The dragon was eating existence to fuel its manifestation. Ichigo felt a tug on his soul. It wasn't just physical matter. The dragon was eating reishi. It was consuming the spiritual fabric of the world. If it wasn't stopped, it would leave the earth a lifeless husk void of both matter and spirit. Goku stood up. He didn't power up to Super Saiyan. He didn't have the energy. He simply walked toward the dragon. He looked tired. He told the others to stay back. He said this was his mess. He had used the balls too many times. He had relied on the reset button of the universe to fix his mistakes. And now the button was fighting back. But before Goku could take another step, a blur of white motion shot past him. It was Gohan. The son did not wait for the father's permission. Gohan slammed into the dragon's leg, his fist impacting the bone armor with the force of a meteor. The dragon didn't flinch. It looked down at the insect striking it and swatted Gohan away. Gohan crashed through a mountain range, but he didn't stop. He rebounded instantly, his eyes glowing with that cold teal light. He fired a Masenko, but the energy wasn't yellow. It was a dark, muddy red. The blast struck the dragon's chest, splashing harmlessly against the embedded dragon balls. The dragon raised a hand and a spear of bone shot from its palm, impaling Gohan through the shoulder. Gohan didn't scream. He grabbed the spear, broke it off, and kept fighting. He was fighting like a berserker numb to pain, driven only by the biological imperative to destroy the threat. Ichigo watched in horror. He realized what Gohan had become. He wasn't just an Arrancar hybrid. He was a creature of instinct. The human part of Gohan, the scholar, the pacifist, was buried deep under the armor protecting itself from the trauma of the convergence. Ichigo looked at Goku. He told the Saiyan that they couldn't win this with force. The dragon was feeding on energy. Every blast they fired, every transformation they used was just feeding it. It was an entropy engine. To kill it, they had to starve it, or they had to hit it with something it couldn't digest. Vegeta scoffed, even as he leaned against a rock for support. He asked what kind of energy a monster like that wouldn't eat. It had eaten the hopes of the planet. Ichigo looked at his sword, Tensa Zangetsu, which was chipped and dull. He said there was one thing it couldn't eat: acceptance. The dragon was made of desire. The desire to undo the past, the desire to cheat death. To defeat it, they had to hit it with the acceptance of the end. It sounded metaphysical and useless to Vegeta, but Goku understood. He looked at the dragon, and then at his own hands. He said they needed to erase it, not kill it, erase it, but they didn't have the power. Goku was running on fumes. Vegeta was broken. Gohan was mindless. Piccolo and the others were miles away dealing with the fallout in the cities. It came down to the two of them, the intruder and the protector. Ichigo proposed a gamble. He explained the concept of the final Getsuga Tensho. In his world, it was a technique where the user became the attack itself, sacrificing their powers to transcend the limits of the soul. He couldn't do it again. He had burned that bridge years ago against Aizen and regained his powers only through external means. But the principle remained. Fusion. Not the fusion dance that Goku knew, but a fusion of energies. Ichigo offered his Reiatsu. All of it. He was a battery of foreign, dense spiritual pressure that the dragon had not adapted to. If he poured his remaining life force into Goku, and if Goku could focus that chaotic energy into a single point, they might be able to create a frequency that would destabilize the dragon's core. Goku looked at Ichigo. He asked what would happen to Ichigo. Ichigo shrugged a weary gesture that seemed too old for his face. He said he would probably lose his powers again. Maybe he would die. The atmosphere here was toxic to a depowered spirit. But he was stranded anyway. He couldn't go home. The rift was closed. If he didn't fight, he would be eaten by the dragon along with everyone else. It wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was a logical calculation. Goku nodded. He accepted the logic. He stepped closer to Ichigo. He placed his hand on Ichigo's chest. He didn't need to learn a technique. He just needed to open his flow. Ichigo dropped his mental barriers. He visualized the floodgates of his inner world opening. The ocean of power, the hollow, the Quincy, the Shinigami. Every drop of the complex hybrid storm that was Ichigo Kurosaki poured out. It didn't leak into the air. It flowed into Goku. The reaction was violent. Goku screamed as the cold, heavy Reiatsu invaded his Kai network. It was like pumping liquid nitrogen into a combustion engine. His veins turned black, then blue, then white. His golden aura flickered and died, replaced by a towering column of black flame. The ground beneath them cracked not from pressure, but from the sheer wrongness of the energy. Goku's body began to warp. His muscles expanded, his skin hardened. He was fighting to contain the foreign power to keep it from tearing him apart. He wasn't transforming into a Super Saiyan. He was becoming a vessel for the void. Meanwhile, Gohan was losing. The hollow Shenron had tired of the gnat. It grabbed Gohan with a massive skeletal hand and squeezed. The sound of Gohan's ribs cracking echoed across the valley. The dragon opened its mouth, preparing to fire a blast of negative energy that would vaporize the boy. Vegeta saw it. The Prince of Saiyans, who had nothing left but his pride, roared. He couldn't fire a blast. He couldn't fly. So he ran. He ran across the broken ground, screaming at the dragon. He picked up a rock, a simple jagged stone, and threw it. It bounced off the dragon's leg harmlessly. But the insult worked. The dragon looked down. It saw the broken prince standing there defying a god. The distraction bought a second. One vital second. Goku opened his eyes. They were no longer the eyes of a Saiyan. They were completely black with iridescent irises. He didn't speak. He vanished. He appeared above the dragon. The speed was absolute. There was no travel time. He was simply there. He raised his hand. He didn't form a spirit bomb. He didn't cup his hands for a Kamehameha. He held his hand out flat palm down like a blade. The energy Ichigo had given him condensed. It turned into a flat disk of black light, spinning so fast it hummed with a frequency that made the teeth of everyone in the hemisphere ache. The hollow Shenron sensed the threat. It dropped Gohan and looked up. It fired its breath attack, a beam of pure rot. Goku didn't dodge. He brought his hand down. The black disc sliced through the beam, splitting the rot in two. The attack continued downward. It wasn't a beam. It was a cut, a single vertical severance of reality. The attack struck the dragon's head. There was no explosion, no flash of light. The world simply went silent. A thin black line appeared running down the center of the dragon's skull, through the circle of Dragon Balls and down the length of its body. The dragon paused. It tried to roar, but its vocal cords were severed. The black line widened. The white bone began to flake away, dissolving into grey dust. The Dragon Balls in the center of the chest shattered. Not cracked, shattered. They turned into powder blowing away on the wind. The dragon collapsed, folding in on itself. As it died, it released the energy it had consumed. But it didn't release it as restoration. It released it as a shockwave of pure kinetic force. Goku was caught in the center of the blast. He was thrown upward, his body limp. The energy Ichigo had given him was gone, expended in the single strike. He fell from the sky, crashing into the dust beside Vegeta. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy. The threat was gone. The Dragon Balls were gone. The connection to the magical wish-granting salvation of the universe was severed forever. Ichigo fell to his knees. He felt light, too light. He couldn't sense Zangetsu. He couldn't sense the spirits in the air. He couldn't even sense Goku's life force. He was blind, deaf, and numb to the spiritual world. He looked at his hands. They were fading, turning translucent. He wasn't dying. He was ghosting. Without his spiritual pressure to anchor him, the physical laws of this universe were rejecting his presence. He was becoming a background static. Gohan crawled out of the crater. His armor was cracked and broken, revealing patches of human skin beneath. He looked at his father. Goku was breathing, but it was shallow. The black veins were receding, leaving scars that looked like lightning strikes across his body. Vegeta limped over, dragging his useless leg. He looked at the dust where the dragon had been. He looked at the empty spot where the Dragon Balls had been. He spat on the ground. He said it was finally over. The crutch was gone. They would have to live with their consequences now. But the victory was not clean. The world was scarred. The sky was a permanent dull grey, the sun filtering through a haze of spiritual debris that would take decades to settle. And the people were changed. In the cities, the hospitals were full of patients with spiritual sickness, souls that had been bruised by the pressure of the convergence. There was no magic bean to fix that. There was no wish to undo it. Ichigo tried to stand, but his legs passed through the ground. He gasped. He was falling through the earth. He was becoming intangible. He looked at Goku, who was stirring. Goku opened his eyes and saw Ichigo sinking. He reached out. He grabbed Ichigo's hand. His grip was weak, but it was physical. For a moment, the connection held. Goku looked at Ichigo with a sad smile. He thanked him. He said he had never felt power like that. It was lonely. Ichigo smiled back, a ghost of a smile. He said it was only lonely if you held it alone. Goku's grip slipped. Ichigo didn't fall into the earth. He simply faded. The density of his existence dropped below the threshold of the Dragon Ball universe's reality. He didn't return to the Soul Society. He didn't go to hell. He became a part of the ambient energy of the earth. A guardian spirit that couldn't interact but could watch. A ghost in the machine. Gohan stood up. He walked over to where his father lay. He looked down at the scarred body of the strongest warrior in the universe. Gohan's eyes were no longer teal. They were black. The beast had receded, but it hadn't left. He looked at his own hands. The claws were gone, but the fingertips were hard, calcified. He clenched his fist. He looked at the horizon. The threats were gone, but the era of peace was a lie. They were living in a post-apocalyptic spiritual wasteland. Vegeta sat down on a rock. He looked at the sky. He felt the absence of the Dragon Balls like a missing limb. He realized that for the first time in his life he was truly mortal. If he died today, he stayed dead. The thought terrified him. And then it liberated him. He started to laugh. A dry, rasping laugh that echoed across the dead landscape. He laughed at the absurdity of it all. They had punched gods. They had broken dimensions. and in the end, they were just 3 broken men sitting in the dirt. The camera of the narrative pulled back, rising above the wasteland. It showed the scars on the planet, the tectonic shifts, the craters, the grey sky. It showed the Z fighters battered and changed. It showed the empty space where Ichigo had been. And it showed the dust of the Dragon Balls mixing with the soil, waiting to become part of the geological history of a world that had moved on. The story didn't end with a wave or a smile. It ended with the wind blowing the dust over the bodies of the living and the memories of the dead. The timeline was secured, but it was a cold, hard reality that remained. The crossover was over. The consequences were just beginning. The historical records refer to the period following the convergence as the Grey Decade, a time when the Earth struggled to metabolize the sheer volume of spiritual particulate matter left behind by the dimensional breach. The sky remained a pale, washed-out violet for 3 years before the atmosphere finally cycled back to a recognizable blue. But even then, the sunlight felt colder. The Dragon Balls were never restored. Their destruction was accepted by the populace not as a tragedy, but as a maturation. Without the magical safety net of a wish-granting dragon, humanity was forced to value life with a terrified intensity that had been absent during the golden age of heroes. Death became permanent again. When a city was destroyed, it stayed destroyed. When a soldier fell, they stayed buried. This shift in reality caused a cultural revolution. Temples were built not to the gods who had failed, but to the memory of the lost. Capsule Corp pivoted from space travel to spiritual medicine, developing regulators for the ghost sickness that plagued those who had been too close to the rift. Bulma Briefs grew old with a hardness in her eyes, her genius dedicated to stabilizing the planetary vibration field to ensure the door to the other side never opened again. The Z fighters faded into myth. They did not disappear, but they ceased to be the bright public figures of the Cell Games era. Son Goku retired to the mountains, but he was no longer the carefree martial artist who sought strong opponents. The black scars on his body never faded, pulsing with a dull ache whenever the barometric pressure dropped. He spent his days in meditation trying to reconcile the Saiyan biology with the void that had touched his soul. He rarely fought, and when he did, it was with a terrifying efficiency that lacked all joy. He had learned that mercy was a luxury afforded only to those who could wish their mistakes away. Vegeta lived out his days in quiet contemplation of his mortality, finding a strange peace in the knowledge that his end would be final. He trained Trunks not to be the strongest in the universe, but to be the most disciplined, teaching him that power without a container was just a bomb waiting to go off. And Gohan became the silent watcher. The carapace beneath his skin made him ageless, a biological sentinel who stood on the lookout for threats that defied logic. He was no longer a scholar. He was the ghost of the wasteland, the monster who kept other monsters at bay. As for Ichigo Kurosaki, he became a ghost story. There were no statues of him, no history books recording his name. He was the anomaly, the intruder who had broken the world to save it. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew through the canyons of the impact zone, travelers would report a strange sensation, a feeling of heavy protective pressure that made it hard to breathe but easy to sleep. Some said they heard the sound of a rattling chain in the wind. Others claimed to see a black butterfly fluttering against the moon. He was gone, dissolved into the ley lines of the planet, but his Reiatsu remained a permanent alteration to the background radiation of the world. The timeline continued scarred tissue forming over the wound, tough and unyielding. It was a darker world, a quieter world, but for the first time in its history, it was a world that had to carry its own weight. The era of the dragon was over. The long silence had begun,